Turn this into a three-dimensional bow block. Hi, I'm Monica, and this is my bow quilt. I made this quilt in 2011 and it features a great 3D bow and a textured ruffle. Today I'm going to show you how to achieve this cool effect in your Quilt-as-you-go quilts. The blocks finish at 12.5 inches. The center square is cut 6.5 inches and the border strips are cut 2 inches. From 4 fat quarters you will be able to get 4 blocks, and from 1 fat quarter you'll be able to cut an outer border, an inner border, a bow center, and you'll also have an extra strip of fabric, a 2.5 inch strip to make the frill around the outside edge. Once you've cut out all of your pieces, arrange them in different combinations ready to sew. If you're interested, this pattern is available as a PDF purchase on our website. It has step-by-step photo instructions as well as full-size template pieces. To sew the bow, take 2 bow pieces of the same fabric, place them right sides together, and head to the sewing machine and sew the top and bottom edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have stitched the top and bottom edges, make some small little snips with your scissors at the top and bottom edge, and then turn through to the right side and head to the iron to press. Snip away the excess corners of the bow. And now take the center square, fold it in half, and sew down the long raw edge. Seam sewn, now we're going to turn it through. I'm going to turn it through using a loop turner. There we are, and now press with the seam centered on the back. Next step, fold the bow center in half and stitch across the raw end with a 1/4 inch seam. Now the seam has been sewn, I'm going to position that in the middle on the back of our little bow tie piece there, and I'm going to press that seam open. Take your center 6.5 inch square and fold it in half one way, press a crease, and do the same in the other way to find the center. Then take your little bow center piece, there's our raw seam on the back, and we're going to position that onto our square, our center square in the center, and stitch across the top edge nice and close to the edge, and do the same to the bottom edge, and make sure that you do a little reverse stitch at the beginning and end of each row of stitching. And here's a trick for sewing the gathered center of the bow. First of all, go to the iron and fold the bow in half and press a crease. That's going to indicate our center. And just with your standard foot on, begin sewing at the top edge of the bow with a reverse stitch. Then stop and lift your foot up, and then scrumple the bow fabric. So scrumple, if that's a word, or gather or crunch that fabric up towards the needle, and then pop the foot down and sew to the end. When you get to the end, reverse back to keep that nice and secure. And there's our gathered bow center. Mark the centers of the raw side edges of the bow, and then hook the ends up with a safety pin and thread the bow through the bow center. First of all, pin the bow, the center side edge of the bow together with the center crease. Spread the bow out and pin it at the top edge and at the bottom edge, and do the same to the other side. Head to the machine and sew down both raw side edges of the bow with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Here's our bow, and here's a tip for sewing on your borders to ensure that your block ends up nice and square and even. Make all of your bows with the grain line of the background square running down. This is the direction with no stretch. The border strips have been cut across the fabric, so they'll be slightly stretchy. So when you go to sew them onto the side edges, place them right sides together, but sew with the more solid edge of your background square on top. The next tip is to sew with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here are my side pieces sewn on, and you can see they're nice and level at the top and bottom edge. Now the reason why you take a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is that allows for that extra little bit of fabric that is taken up when the seam is pressed to one side. So now when I go to sew my top and bottom borders on, you can see that all edges are exactly the same size. Now when we go to sew, we can sew with our outside border strips on top, and that's because all of our pieces now are in the same direction. All the grain is in the same direction. And here's a tip for machines that have the function of moving the needle position. Attach your 1/4 inch foot and bring the needle down into the hole. You'll see that there's actually still a little bit of space between the needle and the edge of the foot. So if you can move your needle over, you have to have your needle in the highest position. I just press my little button once, and I'm actually able to press that button twice. It brings the needle over a fraction, and then when I bring my needle down, you can see that it's not hitting the edge of the foot. So double check, make sure that the needle isn't hitting the edge of the foot. And now what you have is a distance of slightly less than 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the needle. Now please only use that tip if you are 100% sure that your needle is not going to hit the foot. First row of borders are sewn on, and now it's time to start with the outer borders. And here's my completed block, finishing at exactly 12.5 inches square. Now it doesn't matter if your blocks end up slightly smaller, just as long as they all end up the same size. Here are 4 blocks made from 4 back quarters. You can make this quilt in 2 sizes. 16 blocks make a lap size quilt and 24 blocks make a single bed quilt. Now to construct the quilt. If you've been watching my weekly tutorials, you know that I only ever make quilt-as-you-go quilts. So for this quilt, rather than quilting each block separately, I decided to break the quilt up into manageable size sections. I joined the blocks together in rows, and then I joined the rows together in pairs, giving me 2 separate sections. I then layered the sections together with the batting and backing and quilted straight lines going across and down, connecting the seams. Quilt all the way from edge to edge on the top section, and on the bottom section, leave a 2-inch opening at the joining edge. I joined the 2 sections together using my 1 to 3 method, which you can see in my video, which is called Quilt-as-you-go Without Sashing Part 2. I'll put the link for this in the description below. Once the 2 sections were joined together, I then added a 6.5 inch border using my easy Quilt-as-you-go border method. I also have a video for that, and the link will also be in the description. The next step is to add the frill, and I have a neat trick for this, so keep watching. The frills are all separate strips, so take 1 strip and place it right sides together with a background strip of the same size. Stitch all the way around the edge, just rounding off the ends with a little bit of a point there, leaving a 2-inch opening on one edge. Trim away the excess fabric. And turn your strip through to the right side using a chopstick. And here's another tip. If you have a tube like this, you can slip it into between the 2 strips of fabric, push it all the way down to the end, and use the stick to push it all the way out through our opening in the center. And you can do the same thing to the other side. Next step is to press the strip. Hand sew the opening together. To gather the frill, I'm going to gather it up with elastic. So I have 1/4 inch elastic. I'm just going to center that on the back of my strip, and I will first of all start with a little reverse stitch forwards and backwards, and then stitching along a little bit until I can grab the end of the strip, and then I'm just going to stretch and sew. Just sort of put the end of the elastic on the end of the frill, stretch that right out, hold the back, and stitch. Just trim away the end of the elastic. To sew the frill on, all you have to do is just position it in the center of your border, pin it in place, and then just straight stitch, sewing exactly on top of the stitching line that was our gather stitch. And it's just a matter of overlapping all of the frills in the different fabrics, sewing them all the way around the edge of the quilt. To finish off the quilt, just finish off with a traditional 2.5 inch wide binding. Hey, one more thing. Do you have a huge stash of fabrics at home like me? Well, if so, I challenge you to make a crazy patchwork block like I show in my video and post it on our Facebook page. We'd love to see it.